Alright, let's get into it. Number 10. Eel pie. In medieval London, eel pie was everywhere. Street vendors sold it along the banks of the Thames for a penny, working class families ate it on weeknights, and cookshops kept it warm in the embers throughout the day. It was cheap, abundant, and filling. Nobody questioned it. They had been eating it for centuries, and the Domesday Book of 1086 records eel renders from dozens of English estates, confirming that eels were not a curiosity but a commercial staple across the country. The eels came from the Thames, so did everything else. Medieval London had no sewage system in any modern sense, and the river that supplied the city's drinking water, its fish markets, and its eel harvest was the same river that received its butchery waste, its human waste, and the runoff from its tanneries and slaughterhouses. Eels are bottom feeders by nature, consuming decomposing organic matter from riverbeds, which means they were living inside the city's contamination and bioaccumulating whatever the Thames absorbed. Then comes the cooking problem. A medieval eel pie enclosed its filling in a dense pastry crust, which acted as insulation rather than a container. The thick walls of the crust absorbed heat from the outside, while the center of the filling, packed tightly with eel flesh, remained at temperatures perfectly suited to bacterial survival. The parasite Anisakis simplex, a roundworm present in eels and other fish, causes severe gastric infection when flesh is not fully cooked through, and medieval kitchens had no means of verifying internal temperature. Food historian Maggie Black, writing in the Medieval Cookbook, describes medieval pie cooking as a process where the crust was often considered done long before the filling was safe. The eel inside that crust had been pulled from a contaminated river, stored in conditions with no refrigeration, and prepared in a kitchen where cross-contamination was simply the normal state of affairs. The people of medieval London ate eels by the thousand from a river they also used as a toilet. They had no knowledge of germ theory, no framework for understanding what they were consuming alongside the flesh, and no reason to question a food that had sustained urban populations for generations. What other meals do we accept without question simply because they have always been there? Number 9. Verjuice. Medieval cooks prize verjuice above almost any other souring agent. Pressed from unripe grapes or wild crab apples, it appears in hundreds of recipes across the most important culinary documents of the period, including Guillaume Tirel's Le Viandier, compiled between approximately 1300 and 1395, and The Form of Cury, the cookbook of King Richard II's master cooks, dating to around 1390. It balanced rich meats, sharpened sauces, and was used medicinally as well as in the kitchen. The more sophisticated the household, the more verjuice they used. The danger was invisible and entirely architectural. Medieval kitchens stored and prepared acidic liquids in vessels made from pewter, a common alloy whose composition in the medieval period typically included significant proportions of lead, sometimes reaching 30% by weight. Acid and lead are a corrosive combination. Highly acidic liquids left in contact with pewter vessels leach lead directly into the liquid, and verjuice, with its sharp acidity, was one of the most effective leaching agents a medieval cook could have chosen had they understood what was happening. They did not understand what was happening. Lead poisoning, or plumism, produces symptoms that medieval physicians had no framework to identify as poisoning at all. Abdominal pain, fatigue, cognitive decline, weakness in the limbs, and persistent illness were the signs, and they accumulated slowly across months and years rather than appearing dramatically after a single meal. A cook who used verjuice daily, prepared in pewter, was not poisoned at dinner. She was poisoned across a decade. Historian John Scarborough, whose work on toxic substances in antiquity and the classical world established the academic foundation for understanding this transmission route, has documented how the Roman aristocracy's reliance on lead-lined vessels for acidic preparations contributed to neurological decline across ruling classes. The same mechanism continued without interruption into the medieval period. The more refined the kitchen, the more acidic the sauces, the more pewter in use, the more consistent the exposure. The most dangerous thing about verjuice was not its acidity, it was the container it never left. Number 8. Roast swan. At the grandest medieval feasts, no dish announced power more dramatically than a whole roasted swan, redressed in its own skin and feathers after cooking and presented at table as if it had simply settled there of its own accord. Swans were not merely food. Under English law, codified by the Royal Statute of 1482 during the reign of Edward IV, all unmarked mute swans on open water were property of the crown. Eating one without authorization was illegal. Records of the coronation banquet of Henry V in 1413 confirm swan as a centerpiece of royal celebration. The bird's prestige was precisely the problem. Because roast swan was a declaration of status, the spectacle of its presentation mattered as much as its taste. The reskinning technique, in which the cooked bird was carefully recased in the raw, unprocessed skin it had been wearing at slaughter, was considered the mark of a skilled kitchen. The visual effect was extraordinary. The food safety implications were catastrophic by any modern standard. Raw swan skin pressed against freshly roasted meat is a contamination event. Swans are waterfowl that feed in the same river systems used for waste disposal, and they carry Salmonella, Campylobacter, and strains of avian influenza within their systems and on their exterior surfaces. A large mute swan can weigh up to 15 kilograms. Roasted on a medieval open spit, the exterior of a bird that size chars long before heat penetrates to the center, meaning the inner flesh of a perfectly presented swan was routinely undercooked by any contemporary food safety definition. And then the raw skin was replaced, its contaminated surface pressed directly against whatever the spit had managed to cook. The guests at the table saw beauty and abundance. What they could not see was that the most prestigious dish at the feast had just been recontaminated by hand. When a royal cook carried a swan to the table, gilded and posed and magnificent, was he presenting a triumph of medieval culinary skill or a concentrated dose of waterfowl pathogens delivered directly to the highest-ranking people in the room? Number 7. Pottage. For most medieval Europeans, pottage was not a meal. It was the meal, the daily foundation of survival for the peasant majority across the continent. A thick, dense stew of whatever grains and vegetables the season allowed, pottage appears in monastic estate records dating to at least the 9th century, including the Anglo-Saxon document Rectitudines Singularum Personarum, written around 1000 AD, which describes the food provisions of agricultural workers. Peasant families across England, France, and the German states ate it morning and evening for their entire lives. The pot sat over the fire continuously. This is a detail that matters. Medieval households maintained what food historians have called the perpetual pot, a vessel that was never fully emptied and never fully cleaned, but constantly replenished with whatever was available. Leftovers from the previous day became the base for tomorrow's meal. The fire kept it warm, rarely bringing it to a full rolling boil, maintaining temperatures that modern food safety authorities classify as the danger zone between 40 and 60 degrees Celsius, the range at which bacteria do not die but multiply. Clostridium perfringens thrives in exactly this environment. Large, slowly heated batches of starchy, protein-rich stew that are allowed to cool partially and then reheated are the ideal conditions for this bacteria, which causes severe gastrointestinal illness. Clostridium botulinum, the organism responsible for botulism, can survive in the anaerobic low-acid environment of a covered, dense pot. And then there was ergot, the fungus Claviceps purpurea, growing invisibly on contaminated rye or grain added to the pot, caused ergotism, producing convulsions, hallucinations, and gangrenous death in documented outbreaks across medieval Europe. A chronicler recording one such outbreak in the Sologne region of France in 994 AD described mass casualties estimated at tens of thousands. The peasants who ate from the perpetual pot had no concept of bacterial growth, no means of temperature monitoring, and no way of knowing whether the grain they had added that morning was carrying a fungal contamination that would kill them within days. The pot never emptied, the fire never died, and neither, very often, did whatever was growing inside it. Number 6. Black bread. Medieval black bread had a name for the death it caused. People called it St. Anthony's fire, named for the Order of St. Anthony, a religious community founded around 1095 that operated hospitals across Europe specifically to treat its victims. The symptoms were unmistakable once they began. In the convulsive form, sufferers experienced violent seizures, hallucinations, and episodes of mass psychosis that swept through villages without warning. In the gangrenous form, the blood vessels of the extremities constricted until the fingers, toes, hands, and feet turned black, died, and fell away from the body, while the person remained alive. The bread of the medieval poor was made primarily from rye, the grain that would grow in poor soils and cold climates where wheat could not survive. Rye is uniquely susceptible to infection by the fungus Claviceps purpurea, which produces a dark, elongated growth called an ergot body on the infected grain head. Ergot produces alkaloids including ergotamine and compounds closely related to lysergic acid, the chemical precursor to LSD. Wet summers followed by damp storage conditions, both typical of medieval grain harvests, created ideal conditions for ergot growth, and infected grain was visually almost indistinguishable from healthy grain once milled into flour. The Annales Xantenses, the annals of the monastery at Xanten, document a catastrophic ergotism outbreak in the Rhine Valley in 857 AD. A major outbreak recorded in French monastic chronicles in 1128 was said to have killed thousands. Historian Mary Matazian, in her 1989 academic work, Poisons of the Past, argued that repeated ergotism outbreaks contributed directly to the episodes of mass hysteria, convulsive behavior, and apparent demonic possession that were recorded, prosecuted, and executed as witchcraft across medieval communities. The dark patches in the flour looked like ordinary grain. The bread looked like bread. There was no warning before the visions began, and no understanding of what the bread had contained. How many outbreaks of what medieval communities called demonic possession were simply the product of a bad harvest, stored in a damp barn, baked into the daily bread of an entire village? Number 5. Salted fish. Fish was not optional in medieval Catholic Europe. The church required abstinence from meat on Fridays, on the vigils of major feasts, and throughout the 40 days of Lent, meaning observant Christians were required to eat fish on approximately 150 days of the year. For coastal populations, fresh fish was accessible. For the majority of the continent's population who lived inland and far from the sea, the only option was salted fish, dried and brined before being transported hundreds of miles across trade routes that moved without refrigeration, without temperature control, and without any mechanism for assessing whether what arrived at the market was still safe to eat. The Hanseatic League, the powerful Northern European trading network that dominated commerce from the 13th century onward, built much of its economic foundation on the saltfish trade. Stockfish, salt herring, and salted eel moved in enormous quantities between Scandinavia, the Baltic, and markets across Central Europe. Effective preservation required salt concentrations of approximately 20% by weight. Medieval salting was inconsistent, performed by hand and by eye, and undersalted fish created the anaerobic low-acid conditions in which Clostridium botulinum not only survives, but produces its toxin with complete efficiency. Botulinum toxin is the most acutely lethal biological substance known. The lethal dose is estimated at 1 to 2 nanograms per kilogram of body weight, meaning a quantity invisible to the naked eye is sufficient to kill an adult. It produces no detectable taste, no smell, and no immediate symptom. The paralysis begins hours after consumption and progresses without reversal. Histamine poisoning from improperly stored fish, known today as scombroid poisoning, was almost certainly a constant presence in medieval fish markets. The scholar Alexander Neckham, writing in De Naturis Rerum around 1190, described the smell of medieval fish markets in terms that suggest widespread spoilage was simply accepted as normal. The medieval faithful kept the fast, ate the fish, and gave thanks. Some of them, with no way of knowing it, were already praying too late. Number 4. Raw milk. Every morning across medieval Europe, milk was drawn from cows, goats, and sheep and carried directly to the table. No heating, no processing, no testing of any kind. This was not negligence by medieval standards, it was simply how milk worked, and it had always worked this way, and no framework existed within medieval medicine or natural philosophy to suggest it should work any other way. Louis Pasteur would not conduct the experiments that would eventually bear his name until 1864 and 1865, meaning medieval populations lived and died in complete ignorance of what raw milk was doing to them at the cellular level. What it was doing was considerable. Raw milk can carry Mycobacterium bovis, the bovine form of tuberculosis, which transmits readily to humans through consumption and establishes infection in the lymph nodes, bones, and organs. It carries Brucella species, causing brucellosis, a chronic, debilitating illness that produces persistent fever, joint pain, spontaneous miscarriage, and long-term disability. It carries Listeria monocytogenes, Salmonella, Campylobacter, and E. coli 0157. A visibly healthy cow could be an active carrier of any of these organisms, showing no signs of illness whatsoever. The bioarchaeological record of medieval Britain confirms the consequences. Skeletal evidence from medieval cemetery excavations, including sites analyzed in the academic work The Bioarchaeology of Tuberculosis, published by researchers Charlotte Roberts and Jane Boekstra in 2003, documents significant rates of spinal tuberculosis, called Pott's disease, in medieval British populations. Pott's disease is caused by MZ bovis in its bovine transmission form and is acquired primarily through ingestion of infected milk. The bones of medieval people preserve the record of what the milk contained. Children were the most exposed. Raw milk was the standard supplement to breast milk across all social classes, the primary weaning food, and the normal daily drink of medieval childhood. The disease that destroyed medieval spines and silently shortened medieval lives by decades had no name, no identifiable cause, and no known cure. How many of history's quiet, ordinary deaths began at the morning milking in a barn that looked perfectly clean, with an animal that seemed perfectly well? Number 3. Blood sausage. The word botulism comes from the Latin botulus. Botulus means sausage. This is not a coincidence. The German physician Justinus Kerner coined the term in the early 19th century after investigating a series of fatal poisoning cases in Württemberg that were traced consistently back to one source: improperly prepared blood sausage. Medieval Europe had been producing the conditions Kerner would eventually name for centuries before he arrived to document them, and the autumn kitchens of every village across the continent were, with remarkable efficiency, manufacturing one of the deadliest biological toxins on Earth inside sealed animal casings left to sit through winter. Blood sausage, known across medieval Europe as boudin noir, blutwurst, morcilla, and black pudding depending on region, was documented in cookbooks including Le Ménagier de Paris, the French household management guide, compiled around 1393. It was made at Martinmas, November 11th, the traditional slaughter season across Catholic Europe, when animals were killed before winter and nothing was discarded. Fresh blood was collected in open vessels during the slaughter, mixed with fat, grain, and spice, then stuffed into intestinal casings and cooked. The logic was absolute efficiency. The biology was a catastrophe in progress. Fresh blood has a pH of approximately 735 to 745, essentially neutral, making it one of the most accommodating culture media in nature for a broad range of bacteria. The intestinal casings used as skins carried E. coli contamination that medieval cleaning methods could not eliminate. Once stuffed and sealed, those casings created the anaerobic protein-rich low-acid environment in which Clostridium botulinum produces its toxin most effectively. Historian Richard Holt, describing medieval abattoir conditions, characterized them as strikingly hazardous by any contemporary standard. Staphylococcal enterotoxin, produced by Staphylococcus aureus in improperly stored meat, is heat-stable, meaning that cooking a contaminated sausage does not destroy the toxin already present within it. Botulism did not get its name from a laboratory. It got its name from the food that medieval Europe made from slaughter scraps and stored in its cellars for winter, and the naming was a very long time coming. Number 2. Lamprey pie. In December 1135, King Henry I of England died in Normandy, at the Priory of Saint-Denis-en-Lyons. The medieval chronicler Henry of Huntingdon, writing in his Historia Anglorum around 1154, recorded that the king had been warned explicitly by his physician not to eat lampreys. Henry ate them anyway. He died within days. The exact mechanism of his death has been debated by historians for 9 centuries, and the lamprey has never been fully cleared of suspicion, because the animal being served at the table of a medieval king was one of the most chemically hazardous creatures ever to pass through a royal kitchen. Lampreys are parasitic, jawless fish that feed by attaching to host animals and consuming their blood and tissue. Their bile and certain internal organs contain petromycin and associated toxic compounds that cause violent hemorrhagic reactions if the organs are not meticulously and completely removed during preparation. This removal required specific knowledge and considerable skill, and the consequences of incomplete preparation were severe. Medieval cooks who prepared lamprey pie were working without any chemical understanding of what they were handling, guided only by tradition and observation. The margin between a correctly prepared dish and a lethally prepared one was, in practical terms, invisible. Lamprey was also a filter feeder in the same contaminated river systems that supplied medieval towns with everything else they ate and drank, accumulating the heavy metals, bacteria, and environmental toxins of those waterways in its flesh. The dish held such political weight that King John, reigning from 1199 to 1216, fined the city of Gloucester £26, recorded in the pipe rolls of 1204, for failing to deliver his annual lamprey pie. The custom persisted so completely that Gloucester sent a lamprey pie to the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in 1953. Henry the Fern was one of the most capable and ruthless monarchs in English history. He was warned by name by his own physician not to eat the lampreys. He ate them anyway, because some foods carry a power that bypasses reason entirely, and the lamprey pie that may have ended his reign demonstrates something that no royal court in medieval Europe was ever quite able to learn. The most dangerous thing at the feast is sometimes the most prestigious dish on the table. Number 1. Cockatrice. In the kitchens of medieval England's highest nobility, the cockatrice was the ultimate proof of mastery. The recipe appears in the Form of Cury, compiled around 1390 by the master cooks of King Richard D., one of the most important primary sources in English culinary history. 2 animals, a pig and a capon, were each partially roasted, then cut in half at the waist. The front half of one was sutured by hand to the back half of the other. The assembled creature was then gilded with a mixture of egg yolk, saffron, and raw egg white called glaire, returned briefly to the heat, and presented at the royal table as a living impossibility, gold-skinned and posed as if it had simply walked there. Every element of this process was, by any modern food safety standard, a compounding catastrophe. Partially cooking 2 different meats means that neither reached a safe internal temperature in its initial preparation. Cutting both animals in half and suturing the raw interior surfaces together created an internal seam running through the center of the assembled dish. That seam was the coldest point of the entire construction during all subsequent cooking. The junction least reached by heat, the place where raw pork met raw poultry and both sat pressed together, warming slowly on a spit that would never penetrate far enough. Pork carries Trichinella spiralis when undercooked, a parasitic roundworm causing trichinosis. Poultry carries Salmonella and Campylobacter. The cockatrice combined both animals' full risk profiles into a single dish, joined at a seam that the fire could not reach. Then the gilding was applied. Raw egg, white and egg yolk painted across the exterior surface, then briefly reheated, added salmonella from yet another source directly onto the outside of the already compromised construction. The cross-contamination that occurred during the hand suturing process, performed on a preparation surface that had held both raw pork and raw poultry, was unavoidable by any standard of medieval kitchen practice. And then there was the pressure of the performance itself. A cockatrice that collapsed was a social humiliation. A cockatrice that fell apart, whose gilded skin cracked and peeled, whose seam separated and spilled its contents, was a failure that could cost a cook his position. The dish had to arrive at the royal table intact, golden, and composed. This meant that the one intervention that might have mitigated the danger, cooking it long enough and thoroughly enough to reach safe internal temperatures throughout, was precisely what the occasion forbade. To cook it safely was to destroy it. To present it magnificently was to serve it dangerous. The cockatrice was not an accident waiting to happen. It was a design in which every step required for spectacle actively prevented every step required for safety. Medieval England's most magnificent feast dish was a monument to the principle that power and beauty mattered more than the survival of the people consuming them. In that, at least, it was perfectly honest about what power has always been. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.